I have spent the past 2 summers guiding canoe trips in Lake of the Woods in Minnesota, and I have had a few run-ins and heard many stories from other guides about their experiences. The beings have lived in this area for thousands of years, and there are many places that we cannot camp on because they are Indian reservations. I have heard this area is referred to as Wendigo country, and there are multiple places named after it, like the Wendigo Isles, for example. I have plenty of stories that have passed on by other guides, which are pretty terrifying, and I could share some with you if there is interest, but I will just share this one experience I was involved in. It was me, another guide, and we had about 7 kids with us on this trip. On the first night, we stopped after a long day of paddling at a campsite known as Little Triscuit. We had one camper with us that was somewhere on the autism spectrum and had big communication issues. As we were making dinner over the fire, he seemed to notice something in the woods behind us. He kept saying things along the lines of, "Who is that man in the woods?" and described it as a tall, skinny man that was all white. We assured him that there was no one there, and that we did a head count to make sure that everybody was here. So, we checked it out and we didn't see anything, so we just brushed it off and went back to making dinner. The same night, a different camper was in her tent by herself because she was the only girl on our trip. As me and my co-guide were starting to fall asleep, we heard her say, "Gilly Vanilli, stop." We replied with, "What? We're in her tent." And she just brushed it off and went to bed. In the morning, we asked her what was up, and she said that something was shaking her tent, and she thought it was us. It wasn't a windy night. The boys were all in their tents, and we were in our tents as well. When we took her tent down, we took the stakes out, and 2 of them were completely bent at a 90-degree angle. We tested out the flexibility, and we couldn't move and get the thing to budge back at all. I've been in some crazy windstorms out there, probably with winds of around 30 to 40 miles per hour, and had never seen a stake bend like that. But we left Little Triscuit and the weird stuff stopped happening, and we had an awesome trip afterwards. When we got back to base camp, I talked to another guide that stayed at the same campsite the night after, and without me saying anything, she told me there is some sort of big white creature at that campsite. She told us that she was going to the bathroom way back in the woods and thought that another camper had accidentally came to her bathroom spot and ran away, but when she got back, everybody was there and nobody had even left the fire in the time that she had left. There are much scarier stories and experiences other guides have been involved in with these spirits up here. Ever since I could remember, I've loved hunting. Squirrels, deer. It started as something my father and I did together, but when he died, I couldn't help but see myself out there more and more. It was his favorite thing to do, and I was lucky enough to be a part of it with him. God knows I miss him so much. After the following experience, though, I'm scared to head back out to the woods. It was a snowy Saturday morning looking back, and the sun had just come up. That day, I had been hunting squirrels, but the woods were deathly quiet and still. I sat silently under the skeleton of an old oak tree. Whether or not I saw or killed anything didn't matter. The best part was the beauty. Waking up early and soaking it all in was worth every second of quiet and coldness. Everything was suddenly stirred to life by a gruff, grunting sound. The noise was similar to a buck call at first, but so much lower and guttural. At first, I thought a massive buck was dying in the snow. Then it came again, but close enough to make my blood run cold. Whatever it was wasn't dying. It had moved an impossible amount of distance within those few seconds. I honestly had no idea what I was hearing. I did the only thing I could do, and I sat still and tried not to breathe. Only moments later, I saw something that has changed my life in the worst way possible. The head of a deer with a sickly look and eyes with way too much white appeared from behind a tree 15 yards in front of me. It was motionless, And worst of all, the damn thing was 9 feet off the ground, and I've never seen any deer that tall. This thing looked like it had just been in a fight while fighting off a deadly virus. It wasn't a pretty sight to see. When a clawed hand appeared just below it, I knew this was no deer. It sounds like something out of a children's book of scary stories, I know, and I wish that was all true, but these bony fingers curved around the trunk of the tree, disgusting nails sliding along the bark. The way its head was angled, it was as if it was staring at me, into my soul. Instinct then took over. I grabbed my gun and I ran as quickly as possible back to my truck. I had never ran so fast before in my life, but somehow I still ran faster when I heard that grunting again. Closer and closer it seemed to come, no matter how far I ran away. When I reached my truck, I opened and slammed the door shut. I started it and floored the damn thing. But before I really took off, I made one mistake. I glanced into the woods. As if it had been copied and pasted, that thing's decaying head and clawed hand were now protruding from a pine tree at the forest's edge. I'm sorry, Dad, but I don't know if I'll ever be going back there ever again. One summer, about 5 to 6 years ago, Stephen had a couple of encounters with a Wendigo. His first encounter was on an earlier trip in the summer where their destination was into Shoal Lake. It was a 6-day trip which had about 60 miles of paddling and one portage, taking your packs and canoes over land into another lake, into Shoal. On day 4, they were portaging back out of Shoal through a portage called Dead Man's Portage. Sounds made up from some horror story, right? But the portage from Lake of the Woods into Shoal is called Dead Man's Portage. No idea why they call it that, but it's quite fitting. There was a campsite that is pretty frequently used about half a mile from the portage. We just called this campsite Dead Man's. Stephen and his trip left Shoal Lake, aiming to get through Dead Man's Portage and stay at the campsite right after it. It's a little long, but a nice highway of a portage without too many ups and downs. I believe the Canadian Park Service even cleans out this portage, which may be the only one that is frequently maintained in Lake of the Woods. The short paddle from the portage to the campsite is just a surreal, beautiful paddle the whole entire way. It's through a little inlet with about 10 to 15 foot high cliffs on both sides, covered in moss and beautiful cedars. Stephen and his trip got to Dead Man's campsite, and later on, just before they were going to bed, they discovered they left their sleeping bag pack at the end of the portage. It was around 9 or so it was getting pretty dark by this point. Stephen and a camper set off in a canoe with their headlamps to quickly retrieve the pack. The paddle took them about half an hour, and at this point you could really only see what your headlamp was shining on. They grabbed the pack and started to head back. Shortly after leaving, Stephen started to hear loud splashes of things falling in the water, trailing behind them. He quickly dismissed it at first because beavers are pretty common in the area, and when they slap their tails it sounds pretty identical to a huge rock being chucked into the water. But the splashes kept going and were right on his back as they kept paddling. Stephen looked behind him to see a huge rock the size of a basketball come flying at him and land in the water at his side. They began to paddle like crazy to get back to the campsite and away from whatever was chucking these giant, super heavy rocks at them. Stephen looked back between paddles, and on one of the cliffs, about 15 feet up, he saw 2 distinct red glowing eyes on top of it. The rocks stopped coming at them and they made it back okay. The rest of their trip went along nicely without any other encounters, but I never feel too great about going through Dead Man's Portage. And triple check that I don't leave any packs there when I do.